Get my 6.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Homesteading Off the Grid. You can tell we are well into the month of October when it's time to break out the beanie and the coat. Guys, today's reading, it was my favorite story to write in this book because it was so easy. It was so easy. If you watch mainstream news and legacy news, especially during an election cycle for 10 minutes, and you have just a slight hit of creativity, you can come up with this kind of stuff. This is one of 2 stories dedicated to George Carlin. Okay, reading from October Nights to 31 More Tales for the Halloween season. Today's story is called Stick-a-Hick. And again, I'll read the dedication. This is the first of 2 stories in this work dedicated to the everlasting memory of George Carlin, who, in this writer's humble opinion, was more than a comedian and a counterculture icon. He was a prophet. George Carlin saw these times coming. He told us about these times, and they're here. And counterculture icon. If I had to kind of identify with the term, because everybody, listen, you're either going to identify as something or you will be identified by others. This story was inspired by last year's mid-cycle or off-cycle gubernatorial elections. I live in Virginia, okay? I live in a rural area. That's my backyard. I mean, I have more deer as neighbors than I do humans. So I guess demographically, I am a rural white male, okay? During last year's gubernatorial elections, in which I had no views, in which I had no opinions, in which I had no desire nor any inclination to even cast my vote, because I was so unremoved from the events. I don't pay attention to current affairs because it makes me either angry or depressed. So I come out here and commune with those neighbors of mine, the deer and the squirrels and the rabbits. As far as people go, I spend almost exclusively spend my time with my beautiful bride Dearly, aka Giggly Girl, and our son Daniel, and our very small, very select group of friends, because these people are not into pop culture, politics, current events, current affairs, all these things either. They also, hey, we understand we're passing through, and I want the time that I'm here, and I don't just mean this, where we currently live until our son is educated, and we're probably going to go back to the Philippines, but of course come back here for the summers, go there for the winters. This existence, this experience of life, we're just passing through, and I will not spend my time staying irate and angry about things I don't understand and over which I have no control. I want to be at peace with myself and the world around me, wear it like a loosely fitting garment, and when the winds of adversity blow, just let it go and let it get beyond me. That's how we live. It's our mindset. So, but I couldn't help but hear some of the, I guess what I'm saying is, rural white males in particularly were demonized last year during that off-season, mid-cycle, whatever, gubernatorial election. There was a political party and a mainstream media who wanted to, they were saying, especially during the last week, because the Democrat candidate was projected to win. He was way ahead in the polls. And so the media and the DNC started saying, you better hurry up and race to the polls to secure the win for the Democrat in case these rural white males start showing up to vote, in which case we will go back to the days of the Third Reich. Nazism will be in full swing. We will go back to the pre-antebellum South, or whatever the term is. Well, once you are told over and over how evil you are, how racist you are, how you hate anyone and anything that isn't just like you, you kind of say, you know what? How about I go vote for the person they don't want to win, just to show them where they can shove it? That's what I did. I didn't know a damn thing about Glenn Youngkin, who is now our governor, the Republican candidate who won. I firmly believe, largely in part because so many of us rural white males simply got sick and tired of being demonized as being things we're not. No, We refuse to hate other people based upon their skin color, their ethnicity, their sexual preference, or their gender identification. But we chose to hate the organizations that told us that we do, so we went out and voted for your opposition. That's the motivation behind this story. And let me state emphatically, I do not identify as a conservative, certainly not as a Republican. Don't tell me I'm something I'm not, or I will retaliate, brah. And for those of you who are offended by this story, hang in there. Because on October 25th, you're going to get the opposite view in a story called An Afternoon at the West by God Quintana Caro, Arkansas, Bama, Georgia County Fair. You're going to like that one if you don't like this one. So with no further ado, as my beautiful bride dearly, aka Giggly Girl, would say, let's get into it. Stick a hick. I hope you did your homework and you went out there and Googled the word facetious and found out what it meant. Prologue 1, okay? This is like the story before the story, so you kind of know what's going on. Prologue number 1. There's 3 prologues in this story. James, don't you never call me Jimmy Johnson, had enough. Those damned Able brothers, 16 and 15 years old, and we would say respectively, but hell, James, don't you never call me Jimmy Johnson, could never remember which was which. They weren't twins, but they looked pretty much the same because there weren't too many forks in their family tree. Had been riding their ever-loving four-wheelers onto his property, chasing down that giant white-tailed deer they all called the ghost buck due to its elusiveness long enough. They'd been sneaking onto his land all summer, baiting it, and now that it was October, and the potentially last legal bow hunting season ever, hell, the final hunting season of any type ever, was about to begin. And he knew they'd come back for that giant buck, and he was going to be ready for him. James, don't you never call me Jimmy Johnson, had spent most of the month of September going around his property to the locations where the Abels boys were known to encroach, tying steel cables between trees in order to give them one hell of a jolt by way of knocking them off of their ever-loving four-wheelers when they came trespassing again in search of that deer. You gonna kill somebody, his wife had told him when he first set out to do it. Ain't nobody gonna get killed, he told her. They's just gonna learn a lesson. He tried to talk to the Abels boys about their trespassing, and every time he had, they'd nod their heads and say they were sorry and swore they'd never do it again. And the minute they started to leave, and once they'd gotten a safe enough distance away, they would turn around and yell, "Fuck you, Jimmy!" And then they would laugh and go on their way, only to return, trespassing again at a future date. Their father had gone to school with James and filled them in on the fact that he hated being called Jimmy. It had something to do with coming from a long line of Dale Earnhardt fans from way back. This story is set in the future. You will soon find out. Oops, spoiler. And despising one of his old NASCAR rivals, Jimmy Johnson. They get knocked off them bikes a time or two, he told his wife. They's going to learn and they won't be back. With all of his wires in place, James, don't you never call me Jimmy Johnson, started back for his humble abode. The double-wide mobile home he and his wife lived in on the far east side of their property, which happened to be out in the middle of nowhere. James, don't you never call me Jimmy, and his wife were part of a dying breed, rural whites in America, and neither of them knew just how quickly they, at least James, don't you never call me Jimmy, would become part of the dead of their breed. Prologue number 2. The year is 2052. See, I told you so. America has become a utopia for many, but a dystopia for many others, namely rural whites. The Supreme Court has outlawed the use of firearms of any kind for any reason. Yes, the Second Amendment has been revoked. School shootings and mass shootings alike have disappeared. We'll forget about the fact that school stabbing deaths and school beating deaths have increased by 10,250%, and that mass vehicular homicide in random public places at mostly large public gatherings is at an unprecedented and never imagined level. These conveniently ignored facts are mostly overlooked because, by God, we were finally able to outlaw guns. Now, it appears as if a bill introduced by the House to outlaw the hunting of any wildlife of any kind by any means was going to pass, and a way of life that had existed since man's early stages of walking upright, the hunting part of hunting and gathering, was soon to be outlawed entirely. Okay. Prologue number 3. Yes, Janice said, looking into her face screen. They're finally releasing and fully exonerating Jamal Bowles. He's getting out of prison tomorrow, and they're giving him $10 million in restitution. No way, Nancy said. She reached up and tapped the center of her forehead, activating her face screen. Inches before her eyes, a holographic image of the letters SM, State Media, popped up. The letters transitioned into the latest headlines, and Nancy was able to see that Janice was correct. This is fantastic, Nancy said. Now, who is Jamal Bowles? Sydney asked from the back seat of the SUV hovercraft. He and Benji had been in the back vaping their Delta 20 heroin vapes. No more doing so in hiding now that they were legal. Remember, Nancy said, turning to look back at the two individuals in the back seat, who identified as cisgendered males who had no sexual preference. If it fogged a mirror, both of them would sleep with it. Yet who despised pronouns, anyway, because they felt it was offensive to simply assume, and who refused to be referred to by any pronoun. He was the guy who was wrongfully imprisoned for life back when he was like 18 or something for killing that old rural white guy with the Superman punch. Oh yeah, Benji said, exhaling a cloud of fog. Janice didn't mind if the guys, strike that, if the individuals heroin vaped in her hovercraft as long as they heroin vaped the grape-flavored pens. She liked the smell. It reminded her of the wine her parents used to drink before alcohol was once again outlawed in the U.S. due to the excessive drinking and driving rates. The majority of the population hadn't minded that one because the heroin vape pens had come out around the same time. Why wake up with a hangover when you can just, wonder if you're awake or asleep at all? Can you believe they actually used to incarcerate people for randomly sucker punching rural white men from behind and killing them? Nancy said. I mean, duh, they should have been given Presidential Freedom Awards. I know, right? Sydney said, taking the heroin vape pen from Benji and then taking a strong tug. That's as stupid as how they used to incarcerate people for smoking a joint. The individual said this while holding in his vape, like only the cool kids could do. Once the individual was finished speaking, the individual exhaled slowly, and Janice, smelling the vape, enjoyed fond memories of her childhood, which ended all of 3 weeks ago when she turned 18. Isn't that cool, Janice said, how just 50 years ago they actually got some of these social media challenges right, like the Superman punch thing. Yeah, Nancy said. I mean, that was a worthy challenge. Knocking out or killing an old rural white guy. It made sense. But I'm not too sure about some of those others, like the Ice Bucket Challenge or the Tide Pod Challenge. I mean, what was the point? I know, right? Sydney said, handing Benji the heroin vape pipe again. It's all good, though, because we're walking on the shoulders of giants. I mean, the Superman punch guys had it right. They were ahead of their time. It's just sad it would take several more decades for everyone else to wake up and open their eyes and realize these rural whites have been the cause of all the world's ailments forever, and that they simply have to go. Benji said, you guys do realize we're all white, don't you? The individual said it coolly as the individual lightly exhaled the individual's heroin vape while speaking. The individual had timed it perfectly to where the vape had lasted exactly as long as the individual's words. Yeah, Nancy said, we know we're white, but we all feel guilty as fuck about it. I mean, don't you? Well, of course, Benji said, incredulous. You know why I never fix my hair? Everyone paused, but no one said no. Benji hated it when they did that to Benji, and Benji just answered them anyway. So I don't have to look in the mirror and see my skin. It's a reminder every day that I am responsible for everything terrible that's ever happened in history. I mean, I've known this since kindergarten like the rest of you. All of our public school teachers taught us this. I still don't speak to my parents, Janice said, remembering again some of the early days of her life, the wine, the family picnics, going with her family to help at the soup kitchen, but keeping their purses and wallets locked up in their vehicle so none of the wonderful degenerates they were going to feed would steal their shit. I mean, I can accept the fact that they never told me about Santa Claus, Janice continued, and the Easter Bunny, and even the Tooth Fairy. But to have to go through the public school system to find out how inherently evil I am by birthright? I mean, my parents could have prepared me for this. Yeah, Nancy said, but we can't beat ourselves up too much for this, guys. I mean, at least we're not rural whites. We live in the suburbs, and our parents work in the city. My father actually has to drive within a mile of a ghetto each morning to get to work, so he knows firsthand the plight of poor minorities. And besides, I mean, we get our fucking meat, what little we actually eat, at the grocery store like civilized human beings. We don't prance around through the forest with bows and arrows killing bunny rabbits and deer. Talk about inhumane. I know, right? Benji said. And you hit the nail on the head. They sell meat in the stores. If you actually want to poison your body with it, go ahead. But it makes no sense to hunt for it like a scavenger. Organically raised meat, Sydney added. I mean, how could you eat anything that wasn't grown or raised under the ever-watchful eyes of organic farmers? Even vegetables. I mean, animals pee on them otherwise. That's all right, Benji said, holding up his Killery version 2.0 crossbow. We're going to show one of these rural white hicks what it feels like to get stuck. The group of 4 young Americans, the new faces of the new era, were heading out into the country to participate in the latest social media challenge, a game called Stick-a-Hick, in which young urban folk, white, brown, black, yellow, or any other skin tone of which anyone could choose to identify, whether they were actually of said skin tone or not, drove out into the country to where all those evil, demonic, historically oppressive rural whites lived, and shot them with crossbows. It only counted if you were able to capture it on film and upload it to the latest, coolest social media site, oneunless.com, which stood for one race, the human race, unless, of course, you're a rural white. Just like every other aspect of life in the year 2052, eating a meal, going for a walk, or taking a shit, if you didn't film it and upload it to social media, then it never really happened. It wasn't that the game was legal per se, but it was acceptable, and law enforcement at all local levels had been encouraged by higher levels to look away, turn a blind eye, as it were, to any games of stick-a-hick being played in their jurisdiction, out of concern that people of color and whites of urban descent, as well as vegetarians and vegans alike, would be disproportionately prosecuted for participating. Is that the Killery version 2.0, Nancy asked, seeing Benji holding up the individual's piece. Yeah, Benji said. What did you bring? I've got my Lady Killer Ultralight, she said, holding up her crossbow, which was only half the size of Benji's. It was the preferred weapon of choice for most females, cisgendered or not, and named by its designer, CEO and company founder Chelsea Clinton, for her father, just as Benji's crossbow, the Killery, had been named for her mother. As our enemies, the true enemies of human history, rural whites would say, Janice said, let's get her done. And then she pressed on the 100% carbon emissions-free accelerator to get further away from civilization, where modern humans ate mostly a gelatinous substance that was perfectly harmless in its production, as it was meat-free, gluten-free, and even plant-based anything-free, as the movement toward getting away from eating anything that had ever lived was growing. The Stick-a-Hick participants were now getting further out into the country where all those evil, demonic, historically oppressive rural whites still ate what they claimed their false concept of a higher power. We would use the word God here, but alas, it had been outlawed back in 2038, the whole God concept having been deemed by the courts to be just a pagan belief designed to hold everyone except the rural whites down, had created for them to eat. Fruits, vegetables, and worst of all, meat. Now we reach the story proper. Now that we've finished all 3 prologues, story proper. James, don't you never call me Jimmy, had set his last snare. He was riding his 4-wheeler back home, considering getting up early to go bow hunting himself the next morning, when he noticed a pair of headlights coming down the road. Can't be the Sampsons, he mumbled to himself, wondering who would be coming out his road this far. They're all home. He'd passed the Sampsons' house on his way back from setting his last snare, and he'd taken note that all 7 of their vehicles were in the drive. The Sampsons were an elderly couple who lived up this particular hollow their whole lives. Both had 1 car to drive and a shit ton more for parts, like most rural whites. But it wasn't like them, James Don't You Never Call Me Jimmy thought, to have company. They usually just kept to themselves. James Don't You Never Call Me Jimmy came to a stop in the road. He'd pulled over toward the right side to let what he could now tell was an SUV hovercraft pass. But the vehicle had floated toward him, forcing him, as it were, into the ditch line. "What the?" James Don't You Never Call Me Jimmy began to say, when all of a sudden, whoosh, an arrow went flying past his head and stuck into the tree behind him. "Oh, shit!" James Don't You Never Call Me Jimmy said aloud, very aloud. "Stick a hick!" And he summarily did a fishtail turn out of the ditch line and began racing back in the direction from which he'd come. "How in God's name did you miss at such close range?" Benji asked Sydney. "It was right there." Note Benji's use of the pronoun it to describe James Don't You Never Call Me Jimmy. Rural whites had not been considered human for some time, and it was the accepted pronoun of choice to be used to describe such ilk. "I think I've been heroin vaping too much," Sydney said. "Don't just sit here," Benji said, now addressing Janice. "Catch up to that racist bigot." Janice punched the non-emission emitting pedal as hard as she could, and the SUV hovercraft began closing the distance on James Don't You Never Call Me Jimmy, who planned on making it to the Sampsons' house and then taking cover and making a stand from there. However, glancing back over his shoulder and seeing how quickly the SUV hovercraft was gaining on him, he knew the urban white kids who were out to prove to the world that only rural white people were racist, not them, as their willingness to play the new social media challenge game Stick-a-Hick would clearly prove, were gaining on him too quickly. James Don't You Never Call Me Jimmy blew past the Sampsons' house and made his way around the next turn. Another arrow flew past him and stuck into a tree on the side of the road. It was Nancy who had missed this time with her lady killer crossbow named after old Slick Willie. "Science, damn it," Benji yelled from the back seat. "If you want something done right, you have to do it yourself." Benji stuck the individual's crossbow, the Hummer, allegedly not named after some woman named Monica, yeah right, out the window and took aim. "That's it," James Don't You Never Call Me Jimmy said, remembering that there was a trail just ahead that cut into the forest. "They can't follow me off-road." Benji pulled the thingy-madoodle on his weapon, so named these days because the word trigger was true triggering, and his arrow went flying toward the rural white male on the four-wheeler ahead of him, just as said rural white male appeared to cut hard left, attempting to get out of the road and onto the trail. As it were, Benji's aim had been too far left, pun absolutely intended. So it worked out perfectly in that James Don't You Never Call Me Jimmy turned into the forest, the arrow hit him in the side, and it penetrated his clothes and his skin and lodged its tip in his spleen. "Ah, my spleen!" James Don't You Never Call Me Jimmy screamed in agony, instinctively grabbing his side. He could not, under his current painful conditions, remember exactly where it was he'd placed the steel cable meant for the Abels boys on this trail, but in less than a second after having been shot in the spleen by the social justice warriors in hot pursuit of him, the steel cable reminded him, by the way of slicing off his head as he drove through it. "What the pack of young social justice warriors said in unison when Janice slowed the vehicle to a halt and they witnessed the gore before them. "Did you at least get it on camera?" Benji asked, looking up into the front seat at Nancy. "Yeah," she said, "I think so." "Well," Benji said, "then let's get the fuck out of here and back to civilization so we can upload it. I'm sure there's no internet service out here in the sticks." "It's 2052, you dumbass," Sydney said, exhaling more heroin vape. "There's free internet around the world." "Yeah," Benji said, "but it's slow out here. These dumb hicks probably still upload videos to social media in 360p. After turning and beginning to head back toward civilization, where people bought their food in grocery stores because they had enough common sense not to grow or raise their own, because they fully understood that wildlife would pee on it and stuff like that, the group of four were collectively watching the replay of recent events on Nancy's face screen. "Awesome, Nancy," Benji said, completely satisfied with Nancy's camera work, when all of a sudden, "Oh, shit!" all four social justice warriors screamed in unison. Janice had taken her eyes off the road to watch the video, which had been playing 4 inches in front of Nancy's face, and she'd not seen the two teenage boys, the Abels brothers, coming around the extremely sharp turn she was now entering from the other side. She steered sharply to her left and then to her right, seeing that the Abels boys had attempted to turn in the same direction she had originally, and in her so doing, she overcorrected, and the SUV hovercraft carrying the four social justice warriors went top over end, rolling down the excessively steep mountainside. "Holy shit," one of the Abel boys said to the other. They'd stopped their four-wheelers immediately when they saw the SUV hovercraft go over the hill. The boys got off their four-wheelers and looked down. They saw that the hovercraft had been totaled, and it was lying on its top. "Should we help them?" one of the brothers said to the other. "Yeah," the other brother said. They'd come out into the forest at nightfall with their very strong flashlights and crossbows to try to spotlight the ghost buck. Their fear had been that if they waited until morning, when the hunting season officially and legally started, another hunter, particularly that old bastard James Don't You Never Call Me Jimmy, might beat them to the ghost buck. However, seeing their fellow human in need, they abandoned their dream of getting that monster buck for now, and they made their way over the steep embankment to see if they could help. Once at the bottom of the hill, certainly steep enough to be considered a cliff, they saw the limp bodies of two young women lying on the ground. They'd been thrown through the vehicle's windshield. "Ain't no helping them," one of the brothers said to the other. "Ugh," a sigh came from within the vehicle. "We can help them," the other brother said, and he dropped to his knees and looked up into the vehicle. He saw that one of the young men in the back was clearly dead as he'd been decapitated. Unbeknownst to the Abels brothers, such a thing seemed to be going around on this brisk October night. The other backseat passenger, Benji, for anyone concerned, was still alive. "Hang on there, partner," the Abels boy said. "We're fixing to get you out of there. Come on," he said to his brother. "Let's help him." At that moment, Benji wormed his crossbow somehow in such a fashion that he took aim at the Abels boys, who aimed to help him. Yes, pun intended, even though it wasn't as funny as the last one. And said, "I'll teach you to call me a him, you motherfucker." And the Abels boy at the top of his lungs yelled to his brother, "Run! They's out playing stick a hick!" Both boys took off running as fast as they could, but only a little ways because they'd reached the cliff they'd just ascended. And the terrain before them now went straight up. However, this wasn't their closest route of escape, so they began climbing the steep bank, grabbing rocks and roots and anything else they could get their hands on to aid in their climb. Once reaching the top, the older of the two brothers began to slide. Instinctively, he reached out and he was able to grab hold onto a branch of a small tree. Though not big, it was just enough to hold his weight. An instant later, his brother nearly fell back down, but reaching out, he was able to grab a different branch from the same tree. "Shit," one of the brothers said, "now what?" But before his brother could answer, they seemed to hear their solution. Footsteps. Someone or something was walking on the flat part of the land just above them where they'd left their four-wheelers. They listened as whoever or whatever was up there came to the edge. Then they felt someone or something pulling on the very small tree upon which they were clinging. Nay, the very tree that was currently sustaining their lives. "Help!" the older of the two brothers said. "Pull us up!" Whoever or whatever was above them continued to mess around with the tree they were so desperately clinging to, but they seemed to be making no headway in getting out of their situation. One of the brothers remembered that he had a small flashlight in the case of his Leatherman tool, which he always wore on his belt. He reached down with one hand, making sure not to let go of the life-saving limb he held with the other, and he grabbed the light, pulled it out of the case, and turned it on. He shined it slightly upward. This allowed him to see that the tree he and his brother were clinging to for life was a small persimmon tree, and it had persimmon fruits all over it. Aiming the light even higher, hoping to see their potential rescuer, both boys were shocked to see the very thing they'd come into the forest on this brisk October night to find: the ghost buck. The largest white-tailed buck that anyone had ever seen in this part of the world was above them, and it was munching down on persimmon fruits that littered the branches of the small tree that was holding the boys, the only thing keeping them from falling to their deaths. "Ah, shit," both boys said, realizing their not so good odds of rescue at this point. And just then, as the ghost buck came across a particularly stubborn fruit that did not want to come off the tree, it began pulling for all it was worth to liberate said fruit from the tree, and the strength of the deer's pulling uprooted the small tree. The fruit came off the tree and into the deer's mouth, and the able boys fell to their death. But not before landing on, crushing, and killing Benji, who'd made it out of the SUV hovercraft below them and who'd been taking aim at them with his crossbow. Benji's final act in life, just before he was crushed by the Ables brothers, had been to let loose his arrow, and it shot up between the falling brothers and just missed the ghost buck, allowing said animal to saunter off to its next intended location, a nearby organic vegetable farm, where it fully intended to eat as many organic, gluten-free vegetables as it could, under the cover of darkness of night, and it would, as it always did, pee on whatever gluten-free organic vegetables that it did not eat, and stuff like that. The end. People, society as a whole needs to get its head out of its ass. See you tomorrow for more.